So I've got to do a little bit of introductory work to get us to Romans chapter 5, just so that everybody understands what's going on in the book of Romans. Okay, so here's what you need to understand. The first 3 chapters of the book of Romans is showing us how desperate we are for grace. Okay, because the whole idea this morning is, because of grace, I am. We're talking about existence. We're talking about some key ideas about our identity and who we are. But in the first 3 chapters of Romans, it's all about showing us that we are desperate people for grace. And if you read chapter 1 of Romans, here's what you'll see. You'll see that in chapter 1, there's this whole thing about worshiping the creation. And what happens is the Bible says that we as humans tend to worship creation rather than the Creator. Right? And so there's this long laundry list and this progression that kind of looks like Girls Gone Wild and Boys Gone Wilder. And it's kind of this crazy idea of where we as human beings reject the fact that there is a God that's in control. We reject the fact that God puts in us this sense of right and wrong called conscience. We reject God. And even though in the creation, you look at all the things that God has made and all the attributes of God that are revealed, and we tend to reject that. We want to worship instead of the Creator. We want to worship the creation. And then in chapter 2 of Romans, you move into this idea of religious attempts at keeping the rules, right? If I can just keep the rules, I'll be pleasing to God. If I can just do these do's and these don'ts, then God's going to be pleased with me and smile on me in my life. And so he talks about the futility of those religious attempts. And man, some of us, if we're honest, we come from religious backgrounds or traditions or churches, and it is all about coming to church or coming to Mass or doing these do's and don'ts or keeping the 10 Commandments. And we always have thought that a relationship with God is about all these laundry lists of do's. And the reality is in Romans 2, it tells us that even if we fail at keeping all of those religious rules, here's what we try to do. Try to look at our neighbor next to us and say, oh, well, I'm not doing all those religious rules and do's and don'ts, but at least I'm a little bit better than she is. I'm a little bit better than he is. And so we try to have this religious comparison thing going on with other people. And what we essentially try to do is this. We try to come at God with our own righteousness. It's called self-righteousness. It's trying to get to right standing with God with our own attempts. And you know what God says about our own religious attempts and our own attempts to worship the creation instead of Him? He says, you know what? He says, that is like what? Filthy rags. And he goes, you may try to press it. It may look beautiful. It may look like it's something kind of straight out of a catalog to you, but the reality, it is dirty, filthy rags. God says it is not pleasing to me because it is of self. Then in chapter 3 of Romans, he explains how people view their backgrounds. And so in chapter 3, here's what he says. He says, we all try to get to God and make ourselves okay before God because we say something like this. Because of my race, because of my heritage, because of my ethnicity, because of my parents' faith or my grandparents' faith, or because of the way I look or don't look, whatever it is, we try to get our backgrounds and we try to trust in our backgrounds to be pleasing to God. And here's what it says. It says this. He's talking about Jews in chapter 3 because Paul, who wrote this book of Romans, he was a Jew and by heritage. He was born into the Jewish culture. And here's what he says in Romans chapter 3. He says this. He says, so what shall we conclude? Do we have any advantage over others? Oh, no, not at all. For we have already issued the charge that both Jews and Gentiles alike are under the power of sin. And he says, for it is written, for none seek God. No, not even one. No one tries to understand. No one seeks God. No one does good, not even one.